Hey, everybody, surprise! It's a bonus podcast. Yay! Hey, before we get started, just a quick note. This podcast was recorded, probably 3 months ago. In fact, this really is podcast number 1, and that's what I'll number it. I'm going to put it in now because we waited for some approvals for this. This is Steve de Albuquerque, and Steve is the Global Safety Manager, and the company's name is ConocoPhillips. And ConocoPhillips is very interested in actually claiming what Steve has to say. And so I'll give you a little more detail on this on the back end. And so here we go. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Pre-Accident Podcast. I'm Todd Conklin. Glad you're with us. Hey, today's a special day because I'm going to talk to a really good friend and also a really great resource for our discussion, for our ongoing conversation. This is Steve de Albuquerque, and Steve works for a major company, and he is the global safety manager for this company, and it's big. It's a big company, and Steve really works diligently in not only managing safety and safety professionals, leaders from all levels of the organization, but workers. He works diligently to make sure that these people operate in a safe and varying environment. Now, that notion of safe and varying really becomes present in this conversation. Steve's remarkable. Part of the reason Steve's remarkable is because he comes to the journey to the new view in a real honest and open way. He struggled with these ideas as a leader. And you'll hear some of that as he talks about that struggle. It's a big part of where Steve goes in this conversation. That struggle is a big part of lots of leadership. And I like Steve because he talks about the fact that some of these ideas he still doesn't even agree with, and he's tackling them both internally in discussions in his head and externally with discussions with his organization. It's a conversation, and it's a good conversation. And it's a conversation of how global leadership sees human performance in the new view really all over the world, and how to facilitate that kind of change. I think you're going to like this podcast very much. It's a great one. So please sit back and enjoy. This is Steve de Albuquerque, and he's going to talk about leadership and the new view.
Oh, thinking about safety right now, that's kind of a hard question to answer. I'm not sure I could give it in one answer. I don't know if it's thinking about safety. It's more about thinking about people and how we manage the process around the people aspect of our business, understanding that people are going to make mistakes. I mean, the fundamental premise in my mind now, after listening to you speak several times, Todd, is that people are going to make mistakes. And when people do make mistakes, we want to have a system that's robust enough that they fail softly when we know they're going to fail. And I'm not sure we're there yet as a company. But we've got the right people thinking about that concept now around the world, and I think that's an important thing. So it's about human fallibility, human error, and how we manage that within our systems. In the service of building I'll call it a predictive learning organization, because at the end of the day, if we're not learning from these incidents, we're not improving. And I think we always want to be improving.
When you started this journey and you try to diffuse these ideas, what were the differences between the way you talk to safety professionals, the way you talk to workers, and the way you talk to leaders? Because that difference must be profound.
Yeah, I think they are different. I think we had to start with the senior levels of the organization and get them to understand what we were trying to do culturally, because this is really a cultural evolution. It's a change in the way we do business. It's a change in the way we think about things. And, leaders establish culture. I mean, we talked today about the Marine organization and how the captain of the ship really establishes that culture on the ship. And that's no different than on a ship or on an offshore platform or any of our operations. It's really the senior leaders of those organizations that set the tone for the organization. And what's important to them is important to the workforce. And so we take one approach with them, using you to help coach and mentor the senior leaders. We then cascade that down through the organization through a series of learning type events as sessions that we have with you.
What are the lessons you've learned? What should we know about talking to those senior guys? What have you learned? What went well? What didn't go well?
So when we get into the area of accountability, I think people don't want to give that card up in their card deck or in their toolbox.
Why do you think that is?
Oh, because it's just human nature. Somebody screwed something up, and you want to be able to point a finger and say, why did you let that happen? The fact of the matter is that when they step back and kind of look in the mirror at a high level, in all levels of supervision within an organization, they begin to do a bit of self-reflecting on their role and their involvement in the process in developing our systems. And it's easy to blame people. It's harder to pinpoint kind of where our system failed the worker. And I know you talk a lot about that, but when we actually do that, I think we build a more robust system and in the end prevent something from happening again.
When did those senior guys turn? I mean, when did it become really obvious that the senior guys were turning?
Oh, geez, I'm not sure if I could put my finger on a specific event, but I think it's been a cultural thing that's happened over time. It's not one session that does it. I mean, you need some soak time. When you hear some of the things that have come from your pre-accident investigations book and the way you speak, it takes a bit of reflection, outside the actual training session for people to really get a feel for what you're talking about. They have to think about it. And there's some really hard concepts in there to get your head around. I don't know that I'm particularly in the same place on all aspects.
What do you think, what's the difference when you work with the safety professionals, when you work either laterally or down? How are you managing the change with those guys? Because I think that's really an interesting comment. And you've got some expertise in this at this level, for sure.
Yeah, so there's three levels of the organization we try to touch. We try to touch the senior leaders. We just talked about them. We try to touch the mid-level management, the actual workers. Actually, I guess it's four, the people at the coalface. But then it's the HSE professionals, the safety professionals out in the field. And quite frankly, they've done their investigations so many times and come to the same conclusions that the employee failed to follow the procedure, human error, things like that I think it's hard for them to grasp and take a step back and say, oh, we've been thinking about this differently. But when you bring in the idea of defenses and barriers in building error-tolerant systems, I think it does make a difference. In the analogies that you use, the examples that you use, the car industry, I think is a logical journey, a logical cultural journey to get individuals from kind of where they've historically been to where we want to go, using very specific examples. And you have very powerful examples, counting the F's, the difference between an error and a violation, and is error a choice? Error's not a choice. You made a mistake. You forgot.
Oh, how quickly you change. This was a hard change.
Yeah. So I guess that's the difference. The main difference is the safety guys are so used to doing investigations one way to kind of flip it on their head and actually take kind of an after-action review approach of what did we want to do, what happened, and what would we do differently going forward, I think is a bit different approach. It's a more simplistic approach, and I think people are looking for a really complex kind of type process, but it's really not that complex. And when you actually see a learning team in action where you actually develop and you talk about defenses or lack thereof, and you talk about kind of corrective actions or things you do differently, I think it's a completely different outcome that takes it away from the individual and toward the process.
So what's next for you guys? Where are you going to go from here?
We're piloting learning teams across the organization, mostly in North America right now. We do have some interest in Australia, but it's really getting these learning teams up and running and actually, not applying them to everything, but applying them to successful work, but applying them to also some low-level incidents. We'll still have our standard tools in the toolbox that we do pretty complex investigations with, but every investigation that we do now that I'm aware of, that I'm involved in, we actually bring kind of the Conklin methods in the questions and, the thinking about error-tolerant systems into the process.
What piece of advice would you give another leader at your level who's just starting, sort of looking at this new view of safety? What have you learned that you think are gold nuggets that will help them be successful?
Oh, it's something we all know, but we don't really think about. People make mistakes. This vision of all accidents are preventable, that zero incidents is attainable is just that. In my mind, it's a vision. But the reality is that people are going to make mistakes. And so even though that's our vision, I question whether that's really achievable. And it wasn't until I began to spend some time with you, Todd, and in the way you're thinking and some of the people that you work with that I made that shift in my mind. Because I truly thought in my heart all accidents were preventable unless I got hit by a meteorite walking across a parking lot. But the fact of the matter is that to err is human. And that simple fact really defines a lot of that there are going to be things that happen. And so when things do happen, we want to just ensure that our processes and systems are robust enough that when they do happen, they don't happen in a really bad way.
And there you have it. What do you think? Amazing, isn't it? It's amazing to me to listen to these guys talk and to listen to the thoughtfulness and the concern and the humanity and the professionalism and the resources and the intellect and the knowledge. It's incredible. But what's most important to me, at least what I think about all the time, is how different this conversation is now than it would have been 4 years ago or 6 years ago or 8 years ago. Now we've got managers all over the world thinking differently, really getting to the pointy end, getting in the tunnel with the worker, and really trying to create systems that understand how failure happens so that we can create systems that really manage failure differently. It's amazing. Hi, everybody. Pardon the interruption. Just a quick interruption. Funny story about this podcast. Thought I'd tell you. This is really probably the first podcast I did in the whole podcast series, which is why it's a shorty, and I'll probably put it out as a bonus. One of the issues was after we recorded it, Steve said, I better check and see if the company will let me do this podcast. There's some requirements around the way we do communication. Well, I came from Los Alamos, so I completely understand that. He went through the process to get it approved, and they said, yeah, but we want to do one edit. And he said, fine, no problem. What is it you want to cut out? And he said, you didn't say the word ConocoPhillips. Now, why is that funny? Well, the reason I think that's funny is because I would have never guessed in a million years that their edit was going to be to put the company name in the podcast, but I'm proud of them, and I'm proud of what they did, and I'm proud of this podcast. I just re-listened to it. It's a great one. I'm proud of the journey that ConocoPhillips as a major oil and gas company has been on, because it's a journey that has made them so much more robust and so much more prepared to do the work they do. So here's a bonus podcast for you. It's a great one. And know that Steve de Albuquerque works for ConocoPhillips. That's important. And now back to your regularly scheduled podcast. Hey, thanks for your time. This is the Pre-Accident Podcast. And as always, tell your friends and subscribe. There's plenty more where this came from, and I'm glad you're here.